All right. Well, I'm not. I'm not trying to. I'm not saying that the fact that I'm speaking more than other people makes the propositions that I've put forward true. What I'm saying is that I've put forward several propositions and argued for their logical validity and their soundness. And the only person who tried to put forward a refutation of that was someone, but eventually someone conceded the logical validity of my argument, but he contested the soundness on the grounds that he wasn't sure whether or not there was such a thing as objective truth. And he conceded that if there was such a thing as objective truth, then it would be, according to how we perceive reality, it would seem to be the case that God does exist. That's what he said himself, and we were able to, admit that at the end. He was a very reasonable person, and we had a good discussion with him.
Oh, I have a question.
Yep.
After when some people assume that God exists, what would be the discussion and conversation would lead to after assuming that God exists? Just wondering.
Well, the question would be, after determining that God exists, then there are other things that we would look at, like we would look at whether or not God corresponds with any of the claims made by any of the major religions. I would suppose would be the next thing that's important, because it would follow then that if there was such a God, that divine revelation is a possibility. And there is a question, well, if we are honest and if we're intellectually honest people, then we would observe the claims of the religions which claim to be divine revelation and determine whether or not what has been divine revelation, and whether or not the existence of a God goes beyond mere natural knowledge of God, and if it extends to, divinely revealed knowledge of God. And, we could discuss that. I personally am of the belief that it is the case that there is divine revelation about God, which is found in the teachings of Jesus Christ and his apostles in the Bible.
Okay, and I just want to go back to, what do you define as truth exactly? Whenever you're talking about objective truth,
I want to talk more.
Some sort of essentialist definition that you have, I want to know what your definition of truth is, so then we can argue from there.
So my definition of truth is that which corresponds with reality.
Okay, yeah, I share the exact same one. But the thing is, when you talk about something, being able to grasp something objectively, you run into the problem of infinite regression. That is what I kept talking about, but I was just getting overwhelmed by 10 different other arguments that had absolutely nothing to do with what I was talking about. But anyways, at some point in the concept of infinite regression, you'll eventually are going to come to the point where that God entity might as well not be separate in just reality itself. Like, it really makes no sense. You can't argue that if you need an objective plane to view metaphorically or figuratively below to get an objective sense of whatever plane you're looking at, then sensibly that plane is an even higher plane, hence the infinite regression. So I don't see how God can just be the designer of that and just like be all the way up there at the top. There's no top where you can be. It's infinite. That's the whole point, because if each plane of objectivity requires another plane above that, then there's no definitive plane where you can just sit there and go, yep, I'm the entity of the universe. Like, it really makes no sense.
You're going to have to define some terms, because it's not at all clear what you mean by a plane of objectivity, and that there's an infinite number of planes of objectivity.
All right, so basically, if you were in day-to-day life trying to make an objective decision, or at least the intersubjective illusion of objectivity, you would do so by negating certain variables, or even including all variables, to get an overwhelming sense of whatever it is you're trying to decide. So if you're trying to make an argument of whether you should eat, potatoes, or you should eat, just mashed potatoes, you have to have a clear understanding of all the variables in that situation. So if you were to objectively try to view something, first of all, you can't have any biases. So humans are out of the question. The humans cannot wholly access objective reality, because in perceiving objective reality, you are making it subjective due to human bias. But anyways, I just want to keep going on with the point that to understand something objectively, you need to have a higher plane of understanding of whatever it is you're trying to view objectively. But the thing is, if that plane requires a higher plane to understand it from which you're looking above, then obviously that plane above it needs another plane, another plane, and another plane. So basically, it's infinite regression. So there's no.
Where,
It's
Yeah.
but
Zach, I see it, Zach, or maybe you don't see it.
I'm not, but I'm not under. There's a couple problems, and I mean, the first one that I noticed was that you said that humans are out of the question for being able to discern objective truth, and the reason why you said that is because humans have biases, but someone can so I could hold that 2 plus 2 is equal to 4 because I was biased to believe that. I was prejudiced to believe that. But that's true even though I was biased. So having a bias says nothing about the truth value of a proposition because someone could be
2 plus 2 is not universally true. It's not absolute truth. It is defined under the axioms in which you're using 2 plus 2 equals 4. That's the whole point. That's not some sort of objective truth. Like, no one can deny it. You go to an alien, they're going to find the exact same conclusion. You're making an axiom for that. You can't compute pure mathematical logic to objective truth unless you're trying to define objectivity as truth value, which makes no sense because truth value is determined by axiomatic premises.
Okay. Well, that's aside from the point that I was making, but the point that I was making is that someone can believe something, whether or not someone can come to hold a true proposition, and that proposition can correspond with reality, and it can be a product of bias. But just because that true proposition that they hold is a product of bias, that says nothing about the truth value of the proposition that they hold. The truth value of the proposition that they hold has to do with whether or not that proposition corresponds with reality, not whether or not it was not how it was produced. Because if how a proposition is produced or where it comes from determines its truth value, then that's committing the genetic fallacy. So it's not the case that humans are unable to discern objectively because they're biased.
But my point is, they're not able to discern objectivity as a whole. I know that you can have some sort of prepositional truth that humans can hold objective, but the thing is, just being in the action of a mere subjective creature, it innately limits you to a subjective view. So yes, while you are able to hold some axiomatic standing for, okay, this is objective and it's separate than, having biases and all that, I understand your point. But the thing is, you'll never be able to grasp it wholly. You can't grasp the meta layer, you can't grasp the meta layer from being in the object layer. If you're familiar with that, then we can argue from there. But if you're not, then I can further explain.
Well, what I would say to that is that, once again, you do not need absolute knowledge to have absolute certainty or to be able to make universal truth claims. We're able to make universal truth claims without having absolute knowledge. I can say that bread will nourish a healthy person. Okay, that's an absolute truth claim. That is absolutely true. A healthy human being will be nourished by eating bread. Okay, not only that, but I can also say that a triangle has 3 sides. That is absolutely true. None of those claims require or even presuppose that I have absolute knowledge. Nonetheless, they are absolute truth claims. And there's also a more fundamental problem to what you're claiming, which is that if you are claiming that there is no such thing as absolute truth claims, that in and of itself is a universal truth claim. You're making a universal claim about universal truth claims, right? So then, by your own logic, the method by which you're determining that there is no such thing as universal truth claims is an invalid form of reasoning, and you're invalidly reasoning to the conclusion that there's no such thing as universal truth claims.
Okay, give me a second. I'm just trying to go back to an original argument that you made quite a while ago, intellectual, just so I can actually get a literary summary of what you're saying.
Also, I want to just say, don't be afraid to speak up in the conversation. So the conversation does tend to be dominated by 1 to 2 people, but speak up. But I would say, keeping in mind that make sure what you say is actually relevant, please.
Okay, then I would like to ask something because I don't understand why you discussing. I understand that you discuss about it, but I don't understand the point where it leads to, because from my understanding so far, it's that when we want to know something about God, that is out of we cannot learn it with our senses. We cannot see God with our eyes or hear him with our ears. We have to learn from authorities or from scriptures. What for scriptures? It's like anyway, but that's my understanding. So then why we discussing if we can perceive this material world we are living it clearly, when we would all agree that we cannot perceive God? Or is it that when we can perceive material things, you would say that we can also perceive God?
I would say that we come to knowledge of God's existence by observing natural reality. By observing the natural world, we can observe that change is a real property of the universe. And because change is a real property of the universe, that necessitates that there is a being that itself is actual but was not actualized by another, and thus sustains all change within the universe and causes all to be, right? We can come to that conclusion. And although we cannot perceive God, we can know that God exists by our perception of reality, right? And the reason why I don't have any problem with this is because there are other features of reality which we can't perceive. We cannot perceive quantity, right? We cannot put something under a microscope and say, here is some number 2, or put something under put something under a microscope and say, here is some triangle, right? Because things like triangle, things like quantity, these things are concepts. They do not exist as matter or energy, and thus cannot be perceived via empirical means. But empirical means are not the only method of determining truth, right? Because we can come to truth such as mathematical truth. And mathematical truth is one of the most certain types of truth, yet it is completely and entirely non-empirical.
Okay. Can I ask something to that point you made?
Yep. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. For when we take, I just want to understand it because I'm not really sure if I understand it correctly. When I would take an example, for example, Jesus told us about God and that God is in heaven with his people and that you can enter heaven when you die. So how can we perceive God in heaven and heaven with our senses and without learning about heaven or God from Jesus, because he knows more or heard it from God? That's my question.
So, well, I addressed that we can know God in 2 ways. We can know God through natural philosophy, so we can study reality and come to knowledge about God, because nowhere in the Bible does it say that God is a purely actual being, right? We know that God is a purely actual being by observing reality. But nowhere from observing nature does it say that God is in heaven or that we can come to union with God in the afterlife. That is divine revelation. And so there are 2 ways through which we come to knowledge of God. There is divine revelation, which Jesus and the Bible would be, and there's natural philosophy. And so I would say that we were discussing natural philosophy, and I think that we've come to, the understanding that it's competent to hold that God exists from a natural standpoint. But we can come to the Christian God by analyzing the claims of Christianity.
Zach.
Yeah.
One thing, I was kind of frustrated that it wasn't addressed. One of Philos' points, for anyone that's listening, the infinite regression problem. This is so easily brought down or defeated. Is because they have a wrong premise, or sometimes it is intentional, but now I will presume it is not intentional, just for sake of argument, and that it's an accident. But the original premise made by Zachary was being strawmanned, because he did not say everything has a cause or everything has a beginning. Yes, he stated that everything that has a beginning has a sufficient cause, right?
Exactly.
So there can be many questions. What does sufficient mean? And such things. But it is not everything has a cause, because that would be destructive, right, to his own line of argument. It is everything that has a beginning has a sufficient cause, right? But not it doesn't state everything that has a beginning or everything has a cause. So that's the thing, is that we never even got close to anything like an infinite regression.
Yeah,
right?
but it's not at all apparent even. The reason why I don't believe that things which have always existed need a cause, the reason why I don't think that that's true, is because if something has always existed, it's not at all apparent that would need a cause, right? But
now we get to now we get into atemporality, etc.
Yeah, but it is quite obvious from observing reality that which begins to exist has a cause, right? But it's not at all apparent that things that have always existed need a cause. It seems that by definition, that which has always existed would not require a cause by definition, right? Because if it's always existed, then that means it never began to exist. And things which have a cause are things which begin to exist.
Yes,
So
for example,
You can argue that God does not have, if you're going to go on anything other than what the Bible says. That's my whole dilemma here. If you're trying to say that, okay, that of which it just exists, it does not have a beginning, does not need a cause, because we relegate cause to having a beginning. Okay, but that's an axiom, and you're trying to relegate the fact that God has always existed for some stupid reason, probably the Bible, is because of that's just how it is. So if you're trying to make a premise where even if you think about it, it doesn't make sense, it still doesn't make sense, because why are you even trying to make that premise? I don't see the point of that.
I'm
Philos,
not just assuming that.
Sarah, can you wait just 1 second? Because I didn't get the point from Philos. Can you explain it a little different, please, or again?
Okay, so I agree with your whole point of the definition between, okay, for something to have a cause, we relegate that to it has to have a beginning. And those are two things that are inclusive in each other. And for something to have a beginning, it must exist. But you're arguing that if something never has a beginning or never had a beginning, then it doesn't need a cause to exist, because we put a cause to existing with something that had a beginning. It seems kind of redundant, but yeah, that's what you're arguing. I'm just saying that how can you even argue that something never had a beginning in the first place? For you to argue something like that, it has to be a premise, and that premise has to be not axiomatic in nature, or it's only axiomatic in its own system. And the fact that if you want to work out a conclusion where God has always existed, then you need to change around the fundamentals to make that happen, and it just doesn't make sense, in my opinion.
Well,
How can you argue that not have a cause?
saying that God has always existed because if we observe reality, we can conclude that there's a purely actual being, right? And a purely actual being would be something that necessarily exists. It would be something that never began to exist. It had always existed, right?
Infinite. So therefore, that's one of the reasons that God is logically concluded to be immaterial, because there is no such thing as an infinite within the material. So therefore, we can conclude that it's also see how it's like a tree root system. You logically conclude one, and then another has to be
Yeah,
concluded.
all the divine attributes of God are things that are logically deduced, right? Aside from there are certain parts about God, there are certain properties of God which are not logically deduced, and those would be things that we come to knowledge of via divine revelation, like the fact that God is love, right? And that's found in the Bible. That is something that is not deduced, but rather given to us via divine revelation. And when I say deduction, I mean going from the general to the specific. Deduction means to go from general laws about reality to particular cases.
But I don't understand how, if you're going to try to make the argument that something that has a cause must have a beginning, in that if you want to talk about God not having a beginning, he cannot have a cause. Why should that object that has a beginning need a beginning? It seems something axiomatic. I don't understand how you can argue that that thing, say a human, needs to be created, but then God doesn't. You're trying to do something called begging the question, which is changing the fundamentals of the axiom to what you want it to be, so you get the desired conclusion. I just don't understand how you can remove God from your own logic when it comes to. Oh, yeah, continue. Go.
It's not question begging because we know that humans are contingent beings. Human beings could fail to exist. The reason why I exist is contingent upon, right? It's contingent upon my father having existed and my father's father having existed and so on. My existence is contingent. Not only that, but I began to exist and I also happen to have a cause for existence. We know from observing reality that that which begins to exist has a cause, right? But it's not obvious that that which does not begin to exist, or that which has always existed, has a cause. I don't think that it follows that that which has always existed has a cause, right? Because if something has always existed, why would it need a cause to bring it into existence, right? Because it would have already existed at the time of being caused to exist. And that doesn't make sense. That's why I believe that there's a distinction between something beginning to exist needing a cause and something that has always existed not needing a cause.
Okay. Philos,
Separate a contingency from that always existing. That's what I don't understand. It seems like you're trying to, end the problem of contingency by saying that there is something that is not contingent. How do you come to that conclusion? I just don't understand it. And the fact that you're trying to determine that God has always existed, it just makes no sense, because it seems like you're trying to just fit the narrative of solving contingency, really. So I just don't understand how you're coming to these conclusions. And every single second,
I can explain to you how I came to that conclusion, which is that I observed reality. I observed that change is a real property of reality, and from that deduced that that requires a purely actual being to sustain it, right? And if there's a purely actual being is a being which could not have failed to have existed, right? It's an atemporal being, right? And because of that, right, we would know that it does not, right? We know that there must be something which itself is actual but was not actualized by another, which sustains change. And the reason why it must be something that is itself actual but was not actualized by another is because if there wasn't such a thing, then the number of actualizers in the series of actualizations would always be n plus 1, right? There would never be a original or first cause to all actualization in the universe, and therefore there wouldn't be any actualization in the universe because there wouldn't be a first actualization. Therefore, there must be some end to the series of actualizations, and that end is a being which is actual but itself not actualized by another, a being that does not have a beginning. That's how I came to that conclusion.
Give me a second.
I'm
Did Philos go AFK or can you still hear me?
He said he needed to do something.
Okay. Yeah, I'll save it for him. Or I'll tell you so you can tell him, I guess. I'll point it out.
What I would
You didn't say that there everything is contingent and there's one contingent. Everything is contingent and there's one incontingent. You said there has to be one incontingent. There has to be. It's different than there is just some whatever. There has to be, and then he should fight that with what you mean there has to be, and then we can deduce some more to why there has to be. You know how it goes.
Yeah.
It's pretty basic to be honest.
Since Philos is away, can you talk more about divine revelation?
Yeah, I'm happy someone has asked something so specific. It's good. It's not. It shows that there's been some pre-thought thinking about it, I suppose, about the specifics. Yeah, Zach. I mean, I saw Philo's mic flicker, so I think he's back. But revelation. So it's easy to quickly misinterpret revelation as some spirit or some angel coming to a person. And wow, it's amazing. But revelation is just so all we know, right? So there is all we know, okay? And then a part of that is what we know from observing the natural world and what's called natural philosophy. And then there is simply what has been revealed through divinity, through a divine way, not through our own observation or not through any of our own means, right? So that would, for example, as I said, be Christ, or telling us things, or etc. Or, for example, the Bible, which, for example, explains to us and reveals to us. Like we didn't know, for example, the Eucharist, what that was until it was revealed. We did not know what confession was until it was revealed, etc. These are things that are not possible to observe in natural philosophy or in the natural world. So, but yet we know. So therefore, they were divinely revealed. And there is, of course, there were records being kept, of course. We wrote it down, and we had oral tradition and all these things. So it wasn't just.
Yeah, I understand the part of the tradition part because I do fencing as a hobby, and there's a living tradition where these things, these fencing techniques, per se, are passed down by people who actually knew what they were doing, like knowing how to defend themselves and how to fend off against people who try to duel them. And yeah, I know what the part of the aspect of how tradition is passed down after divine revelation happened. It just passed down by traditions. I get that part. And maybe I'm still kind of cast my head around like divine revelation right now.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's just okay. Divine revelation, just means okay. Imagine I'll give you a metaphor real quick. Imagine lifting up a stone, okay, and it is revealed under the stone, such and such. X is revealed under the stone, okay. But then there is another way of lifting a different type of stone, right? And through that other way of lifting the other type of stone, Y is revealed. So it's just a different. It's not. It's a type of revelation. It's not. It's a type of revelation. You have revelation all the time. Things get revealed to us by scientists. Things get revealed to us by philosophers, etc., etc. I mean, a doctor may reveal that you have a terrible disease, etc. And then there is the divine revelation. It's just another type well, it's one of the two types of revelation.
Another thing I may add is that, of course, the difference between this and what we mentioned before is that this the former is subseral phenomena, right? If we lose the knowledge of something that we can observe, somebody else can observe it, and we can come to the same conclusion, and so this knowledge wouldn't be lost through this way, of course, if somebody else observes it. However, the thing with divine revelation is that, of course, it is written down, it is kept, maybe as oral tradition, maybe as written records, but the thing is that there's going to be several of them. There's going to be some of them that is going to be truly divine revelation, and there's going to be some that will come afterwards.
Can a moderator stop Steve? He's purposely joining and leaving to annoy people.
Yeah, I mean it's a childish.
And
Just
the
like child.
the thing is that the way you can figure out what has truly been divine revelation and what has not truly been divine revelation. Of course, we're Christians over here, so we believe that the Bible is divine revelation, but of course the Quran is pseudo divine revelation. It's fake, right? The only way you can come to the conclusion that one is true divine revelation and the other one is not is through historical analysis. That's the only way you can come to the conclusion, to the absolute conclusion that one is true divine revelation and the other one is not, is through historical analysis. And of course, we could say that this is another type of science, right? It's another type of philosophy. So I'd say that there's definitely a lot of
Overlaps.
It's there's a lot of overlaps of whether we can observe natural phenomena and whether we can observe that this has truly been divine revelation. So of course,